is going to be recorded and will be posted on the ASA Culture section website. So it is a real pleasure to welcome you all here. This is our second Culture and Contemporary Live panel this year. My name is Anna Velichkova, and I'm Croft Assistant Professor of Sociology and International Studies at the University of Mississippi, and I will be your host today. The Culture and Contemporary Live series is an initiative of the ASA Culture section in its third year. It's an online forum that invites our section members to share their expertise and help us make sense of current events and important social issues. The next Culture and Contemporary Live discussion will be on Monday, April 17th at 1 p.m. Central. The topic is the Odyssey and the Problem of Meaning, and the moderator will be Mirai Phillips, a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, who is helping with the technical aspects of today's panel. Thank you, Mirai. Today, we're focusing on belligerent nationalism in big power politics. Violence is an ever-present possibility within nationalism. Belligerent nationalism, in the case of big powers, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China's increasing militarization, and the January 6th insurgency in the United States, has raised concerns about new practices of violence in the name of the nation. How do we understand these dynamics? We have three amazing panelists. I can't do justice to everything they have accomplished. I'll just highlight some of their scholarship as it relates to today's discussion. Olga Shevchenko is Paul H. Hunn's 1955 Professor of Social Studies at Williams College. Professor Shevchenko specializes in memory, photography, culture, and consumption in post-socialist Russia. Her book is Crisis and the Everyday in Post-Socialist. Her first book is Crisis and the Everyday in Post-Socialist Moscow. Currently, she's working on a collaborative project entitled Snapshot Histories: Family Photography and Generational Memories of Socialism in Russia. The project focuses on the production of knowledge and affect about how the family and the national past. Xiaohong Xu is Assistant Professor at the University of Michigan. Dr. Xu works at the intersection of comparative historical sociology, cultural sociology, and political economy. He has written on revolutionary China and state formation. Currently, he is completing a book manuscript entitled The Great Separation: The Chinese Cultural Revolution and the Political Origins of Our Time. Andreas Wiemer is Lieber Professor of Sociology and Political Philosophy at Columbia University. Professor Wiemer is a historical, global, and comparative social scientist. He has written extensively on nation-state formation, ethnic boundaries, armed conflict, and methodological nationalism. His most recent book is Nation Building: Why Some Countries Come Together While Others Fall Apart. We are honored and grateful to have you all help us think through some difficult issues. The format of the panel will be as follows. I have asked the panelists to address 4 questions. Panelists will take turns responding to the questions. Then we will invite questions from the audience. Audience members can type questions in the chat. Please make sure to send the questions to everyone. The first question relates to the nature of belligerent nationalism today. How do you understand contemporary practices of violence in the name of the nation, especially in the case of big powers? What are some important manifestations of belligerent nationalism today? We'll start with Olga, then Xiaohong, and then Andreas.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction and for putting the panel together. I really look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. And I suspect that we were also invited with an eye to our respective national hats. So each of us has, I think, our own national belligerism to speak about, or at least I took this invitation in that way. And so it was an invitation for me to think about Russia and the current Russia's war in Ukraine. But first, I wanted to start in my thoughts just from reminding us about the sort of classical definition of the nation by Benedict Anderson as an imagined community. and a community which in some ways imagines itself as unified around certain overlapping characteristics, usually cultural, linguistic, religious, and so on. And of course, since at least 17th century, the Peace of Westphalia, there's also a sense of territory, right? A kind of a belonging to a particular territory, a righteous claim for a specific territory. And so thinking from that angle, if nationalism implies claims to some form of overlap between this imagined community or a nation and territory, then I guess we can think about belligerence as an answer to those who deny legitimacy to this overlap. In a certain sense, I think it's a little bit simplistic or very simplistic, particularly when I think about specific kinds of belligerent nationalisms and the polarization that they come bundled with. For example, when we think about the US and polarization within the US, it seems that belligerent American nativists and nationalists reserve special scorn for their fellow co-nationals, for liberals, ostensibly. So in that sense, it is a belligerence and violence that actually is directed within the nation, and that's one possible puzzle to confront. On the other hand, you have violence or belligerence directed to the outside, to real or imaginary outsiders who try to redraw this territorial map in ways that is perceived as incongruent with the national borders. And it's certainly belligerent, but one has to wonder whether it's still nationalism or whether we should bring in imperialism and think about how imperialism sits in with nationalism, whether we should think about them as in some ways opposites, as traditionally they're construed, or there is a kind of an imperial nationalism that presents its own puzzle, which I suspect is actually closer to some of the belligerent nationalisms that we're talking about today. I will also want to bring in the state into this question of violence and nationalism. Weberian definition of the state is monopoly on the uses of violence. And we can think about, all sorts of violence, not just physical, but symbolic and economic violence that's inherent in any state power. And in that sense, nationalism can be seen as a way to redirect a response to this violence from the state or from certain elements within the state onto the national others. And there's a certain kind of alchemy of turning class antagonisms, for example, into ethnic or racial antagonisms or national antagonisms, which allows then the boundaries of solidarity to be redrawn in a way that doesn't threaten the existing political order. And that's, I think, what we see in Russia today. So putting on my respective national belligerence, I think Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which is now in its 9th year, even though much has been said about, the first year anniversary of a full-scale invasion, but the war has been going on for 9 years already, can be seen as a way of sort of distracting or redirecting the focus of attention from internal political or economic problems, political instability, and sort of shifting the blame for material privations onto the hostile others who are always imagined as external outsiders. And by this, I mean not necessarily Ukraine at all, which is often invisible in Russian nationalist rhetoric about Ukraine. It's all about Russia and the West and this kind of global standoff. And in that sense, this belligerent nationalism basically ensures Putin's political longevity or eternity through cultivating geopolitical resentments and distracting the focus from in the country issues. So that's my take on it.
Thank you, Olga. Then we'll go to Xiaohong.
Thank you for having me here, and I really appreciate Olga's response to this question. I will just build on her response. I think to me, belligerent nationalism is a phenomenon that sort of sees war and military conflict as basically a presence in and even a goal in big power politics. There's a kind of a simplistic realist view, which would argue that this is very natural, right? It's a natural expression of geopolitics. It's particularly when you have changing power status among big powers. So you could have, you could have defensive aggression in a declining hegemon, right? Declining powers that you could see in part of Trumpism, right? You could also see probably offensive aggression in ascending powers, such as the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy from China, right? That would be a kind of very simplistic, natural, realistic view. We're saying that this is the natural expression of international politics, right? When you have changing power status among big powers. But I think the question is as a sociology would ask is, the big historical variations. Not every change in relative power status in history leads to heightened belligerent nationalism. You could have more peaceful process. Also, it does at an international level, at a domestic level, that domestic politics matter a lot. As Olga just mentioned, you could have political leaders who try to divert attention to their incompetency by sort of directing these aggression towards either domestic minorities or to international rival powers, and that just kind of speak to the question, what are the kind of broader social political context than simply the power competitions among geopolitical powers. Yeah.
Thank you. We have Andreas on the phone, turns out. So Andreas, if you can try speaking, hopefully we can hear you and have you present your thoughts.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry about the hiccup with trying to sign in. Where are you? Is it question 1?
Yes.
Okay. So I would like to just follow up on what has just been said, because I think the power rivalry, what Xia Hong has just said, I think the power rivalry argument is actually quite a good one, and it does indeed explain Russian, Chinese, but also Indian, Brazilian nationalisms, and the rhetorics of it, and it comes, of course, in slightly different versions in these different cases. So claims to co-ethnic territory in the case of Russia and China, so Eastern Ukraine, Taiwan, and so on. The U.S. Claims to global hegemony continue to be framed in nationalist language and the self-understanding that the U.S. is the guarantor and the promoter of a liberal democratic order, and so on. But maybe Xia Hong is right that not every of these power transitions is accompanied by nationalism or by belligerent nationalism. And I think one of the reasons for why that is the case today is also that other kind of grand political ideological narratives have kind of fallen apart. And so the past power competition with the Soviet Union was framed in ideological oppositional terms. Communism has ideologically imploded. So the old framing of power competition as liberalism versus communism and so on doesn't work. And so the only game in town that is left of the big modern political narratives, the foundational narratives, is nationalism. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we see this, why the current great power competition comes together with a framing of this competition and the goals and so on in nationalist terms. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you were able to connect at the end of the day. The second question that I sent the panelists has to do with causes and/or context. How does the contemporary sociopolitical context influence the resurgence of belligerent nationalism? We'll start with Xiaohong, then Andreas, and then Olga.
Thank you. I think I would I think that at least 4 theories have present certain kind of perspectives on this question. I'll start with Lenin, right? Lenin would think that capital competition in the context of declining profitability could lead to heightened tensions and even conflict between big powers that certainly has some truth in the contemporary context as facts in the case of, for example, China and U.S. relationship, right? That the U.S. and China had honeymooned in the 90s and early 2000s, and at the time, Chinese capital and American capital were able to cooperate, but as the the profitability declined, that you see the Chinese state become more protective of the Chinese capital, either mostly state-owned capitals, but also some private capital, and push out American capital, right? And that's partly, the underlying economic strengths that that undergird this probably this tension. And the second theorist that I think would have a view on this is Polanyi. Right? Polanyi would say, that in many ways, fascism, which is the extreme form of belligerent nationalism, right, was a response, partly as a society's counter movement, although in a pathological form, right, to the kind of erosion of society by the market and the kind of social dislocations that came from that process. And so it's, of course, the other scenario would be the democratic approach where people can organize and have this counter movement that would react to this marketization. But the other pathological form is war and conflict. And to some extent, that's true. A lot of the neoliberal globalization led to a lot of socioeconomic problems that partly fueled this belligerent nationalism. The third theory, I think probably that would speak here is Gramsci, right, who would say it's about class politics. It could be certain kind of alliance between state elites, some social conservative classes, and then certain paramilitary group that tend to, rely on violence as their means of existence. And the fourth, I think, perspective, which has to do with communication revolution, I think, Benedict Anderson pointed out how print capitalism fueled that wave of nationalism, right? Because they help to bring faraway conflicts to people who now feel like they're connected to these bigger, the imagined community, right? That to some extent, I think the social media today is related to not both. I mean, a lot of talk about polarization in the U.S. context, but it's also in many ways, I think, related to this belligerent nationalism that we see today. And I think the fifth, which is not exactly this, but I think it's a background condition, which about of belligerent nationalism, which is nativism, right? And I think it has something to do with the fact that we, past few decades, we saw a lot of economic globalization that, that led to sort of mobility across national border, but at the same time, the social sort of connection, the solidarity across these class and race and ethnic boundaries were not really following sort of their steps, and therefore I think that was another reason you have seen a lot of nativism sentiment that was related to this kind of related to belligerent nationalism, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas?
I would like to start with not so much a contemporary social political context, but a recurrent kind of configuration, political configuration that produces belligerent nationalism. That is the shift from empire to nation states, which wave after wave of the dissolution of empire has produced, first anti-imperial nationalism, often belligerent as well, then has produced in the newly independent state a struggle over, usually framed in ethno-political terms, over who has political rights, who is considered to be a full citizen, in whose name actually the new country is governed. And these kind of domestic ethno-political conflicts then often escalate and drawing neighboring countries where the ethnic minority in one country is the ethnic majority, and so on. So why am I talking about that? Because I think there's in the contemporary world of neo-nationalist movements and conflicts, there is at least the Russia and Ukraine situation is actually part of the last wave of this transition from empire to nation states, the falling apart of the Soviet Union, and the kinds of ethnopolitical conflicts and the drawing of neighbors and so on that you see in Ukraine is actually not that dissimilar to what we've seen in earlier such waves. And so I think that's one. And the second contextual feature is what we already talked about, the shift to a multipolar world that fuels, especially since other grand ideological narratives are gone, fuels kind of neo-nationalism. And then the third trend that I would like to highlight, and it kind of connects to what just has been said, is economic globalization that produces insecurity, precarity, in some cases also downward social mobility. And that's the case especially, but not exclusively, in the older, more established nation states. And so people who experience this precarity, insecurity, downward social mobility are drawn to the promises of neo-nationalists who promise them to reestablish the golden age when they had a more secure place in the social world. And so that is a very short explanation, one among many, about why neo-nationalist leaders are elected if there are elections around the world. So to put it in very short terms, the liberal order has not delivered for many people in the older established nation states, and distrust in that order therefore spreads, and neo-nationalism seems to provide an answer. So the rise of neo-nationalist leaders who are elected in India, in the US, in Eastern Europe, in other parts of the world, in the Philippines, and so on. So that's another, I think, important trend, kind of a domestic trend that reinforces nationalist tendencies, even in older nation state, where the empire to nation state story that I mentioned at the first point is no longer really that relevant. So these three trends together produce, I think, the contemporary configuration where you have lots of competing belligerent nationalists butting their heads against each other.
Thank you, Andreas and Olga.
Thank you. I think I really like going after comparative historical sociologists because you painted a very capacious and I think really comprehensive big picture of it, to which I can add just some nuance as to how that actually plays out on the ground. And I think, again, thinking about the case that I know best, which is the Russian one, it almost feels like it's a textbook example of the first and the third reasons that Andreas just mentioned. So the kind of the after effects of imperial reconfiguration. And again, by this, I don't just mean the breakdown of the USSR and its sphere of influence, but also the reshuffling of the world order in which Russia, that sees itself as an inheritor to the Soviet Union, has also lost its sort of place at one of the two poles, but still continues in many ways act as if it aims to kind of claw its way back to it, multiplied by ostensibly sort of the wounds of the neoliberal 1990s, because something that is very clear and sort of discourse around the war in Russia right now is the ways in which the sort of the traumas of the 1990s and the post-Cold War frustrations with the unfulfilled promises of democracy are really fueling this resentment and sort of fixating this on a kind of sort of a revanchist move to reclaim independence after it had been lost to the World Bank and to the neoliberal world order. And that's something that it's a resentment perhaps shared to different extents in the former Second World. And here I would gesture to my colleagues, Kristin Gotzi and Mitchell Ornstein, their comparative book, Taking Stock of Shock, where they basically summarize demographic and economic toll of the transition in a whole range of transition economies. I think they take 27 countries and basically argue that the hit of the post-socialist transition has been greater than the Great Depression by many times over. The average transition economy took 17 years to recover to 1989 levels of economic production. And so as a result, sort of after these inflated expectations of prosperity, a lot of the populations in the region conflated free market and democracy, grew resentful of both of them, and that sort of fueled the nationalist turn and the rise of authoritarian populism and xenophobia. And then the Russian case, it's this kind of toxic knot of resentment gets multiplied by kind of great power pains and sense of loss of its global status. And so hardships that all of the countries of the region went through couldn't be justified by any form of sort of national renaissance, the return back to national independence, and the responsibility for the traumas of communism could not be externalized to another country or another entity. And as a result, we see this kind of reorientation towards the collective West as a convenient scapegoat for the hardships, which I think fuels in very visceral ways, I think, the population's susceptibility to this belligerent rhetoric.
Thank you, Olga. This is a culture panel, and so the third question is, how do cultures of nationalism play a role in the resurgence of belligerent nationalism? We'll start with Andreas, and then Olga, and then Xiaopeng.
Yes, this is such an interesting question, maybe because I don't really have an answer to it, but I think that certain nationalisms have embedded in themselves popular narratives of victimization by malign foreign powers and memories of national trauma. And it kind of follows up on what Olga just said about Russia, where the national trauma is the loss of the Soviet Union, the falling apart of the Soviet Union, the shock, economic shock, neoliberal economic shock that followed, the loss of international status, and so on and so on. And it is easy to portray that as the consequence of the machinations of evil-willed foreign powers. Serbian nationalism has deeply, deeply embedded narratives of victimization, of status loss, and so on. And if you if you go, for example, to the Chinese museums today, I remember the one in Guangzhou, the story of the narrative of victimization by the imperial powers up to World War II, the Boxer Rebellion, and so on, and the aftermath, the Japanese occupation. So these are also deeply embedded in the resurgent, reconfigured contemporary Chinese nationalism. And I think such narratives provide fertile ground for belligerent nationalism, because they make kind of revanchism or the idea of redressing past wrongs with whatever means is necessary much more plausible. And so they make also the idea that there has to be sacrifice today, maybe in the form even of war, to redress these wrongs, heal these wounds, put the nation back into its in the place that it deserves, and so on. It makes such appeals to sacrifice more plausible. I think in other kinds of nationalist narratives, can I talk about Switzerland just for 1 second, because it's another case that I know. I'm originally from there, so there is not really such a narrative of victimization. Maybe there's also less historical grounds for such a narrative. And similar, you would be hard pressed to find it in Sweden, or to find it in the U.S., or to find it in Brazil. So I think there might be characteristics, memory cultures that are connected to specific forms of nationalism that are more or less prone to, or more or less fertile ground for more belligerent kind of war, justifying warmongering forms of nationalism.
Thank you, Andreas. Olga?
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about the point Andreas made. It's hard for me to imagine, at least in the post-Soviet region, a non-victimhood culture of nationalism, and that's really really striking. Within Russia, I think there are actually two cultures of nationalism. So I thought for a second it would be useful to think also about going kind of beyond or more granular than the question of the nation. And for a longest time, what typically was decried in terms of Russian nationalism was a kind of a recognizably exclusive nationalism. That these would be people that were, incredibly invested in sort of biological constructions of Russianness and notions of the national ethnos, cultivating, pre-Russian roots, flirting with paganism, resuscitating, string national instruments, very hostile to ethnic others, of whom there are many within the Russian Federation. Russian Federation is a federal, not in other ways comparable to Switzerland, but it is a federation, and 27 of the federal subjects are ethnic units. So it's a multinational federation, and this more ethnically framed nationalism was extremely hostile to minorities within Russia, as well, of course, as abroad, and in fact was very chummy with other kinds of nationalisms in the neighboring states. Serbia, Ukraine, they all had their own kind of recognizably exclusive, kind of very tight ethnic nationalists. Sergei Ushakin, anthropologist, writes about this type of nationalism and his patriotism of despair. And they actually managed to, even within Russia, to externalize responsibility for communism by framing it as Judeo-Bolshevism, right? So ethnicizing, in a way, communism in a way that kind of cleared off the blame from the Russian ethnos. But what we're seeing with the war in Ukraine is a much more expansionist version of nationalism. That's basically kind of imperial nationalism that I have alluded to in my earlier comments, which recognizes really no borders. It appeals to something called the Russian world, but in fact, the Russian world is very loosely defined as anyone who has affinity to Russian literature or Russian culture. It very much draws on ethnic minorities within Russia and sort of sweeps them in under the sway of this vision of sort of new imperial Russian nationalism, and it's kind of inherently expansive. So it's not actually committed to a particular territory. It has sort of visions and fantasies of kind of global spread. So in that sense, I think that culture of nationalism is actually much more ascendant and deadly right now.
Thanks, Olga. And Sharon?
Yeah, I agree. This is a fascinating question, and I think I want to build on the idea, and particularly just talk about the victimization discourse, and I think it's very there's a gender dimension about that victimization discourse, right? That it's the mother nation that was being violated by external power, and therefore the nation, right? The brothers sort of rose up to defend the nation, or to now to rectify the wrongs that are being done to the mother nation, and I think that gender dimension is even, I think part for me. I think part of that the kind of belligerent nationalist phenomena speaks to is certain kind of crisis of masculinity in our age today, right? I mean, I think that there or a certain tension about masculinity, I would say, right? And so in the case of China, you see on the one hand, the marketization sort of in many ways gave men a lot more advantage than women. There used to be, a stage where during the Mao's eras, there was kind of political strive to kind of at least at the political level, trying to quote unquote liberate women and give equality to women, even though that didn't sort of in a reality did not meet up to that standard. But nevertheless, the marketization sort of bring a lot of advantage to men in the market and in job search, everything in careers. And at the same time, you see the girls, and for example, women are now more than half of the college students in China, and they're doing academically well, even mostly better than the guys, right? And so they feel empowered, but at the same time, they feel limited by the market. I mean, so there's kind of insurgent feminist movement that's very different from old generation, and I think that poses a threat to the kind of masculinity that I think and I think that to some extent the national discourse had a lot of this narrative about this kind of gender narrative, right? Now, I think there's a recent paper coming out from in Nationalism by two grad students who argued, who really trace this discourse like that. Now in China, you have this change of nation from a mother nation to like daddy state, right? Because it's like the daddy Chinese state is rich, and it can, express, I guess, around the world. It's and you can buy off political loyalty from people. So that kind of narrative that now sees that nation as this daddy, right? This daddy who has economic power. It speaks to this. I think a lot of men's, particularly their anxiety about their masculinity, I think.
Thank you. Fascinating. With the last question, we'll try to end on a more hopeful note. So where do you see potential for de-escalation? What cultural resources and institutional resources can be mobilized to counter belligerent nationalism? And we'll start again with Olga, and then Xiaohong, and then Andreas.
That's the hardest question to me, actually. When I was preparing my thoughts, I left this particular question until today just because I thought it was the hardest one. And it's hard because partly because in the current war, de-escalation sometimes can be a code word that calls on Ukraine basically to scale back its commitment to the territories of the 4 regions that Russia has announced as its own already, an invitation for Ukraine to give up Crimea, to kind of settle for something, for some concessions. So the war that has been started by Russia and is now in these calls of de-escalation, that asymmetrical nature of war gets oftentimes erased, where everyone's being looked at as if they're mutually kind of culpable and should work towards a compromise. So it doesn't seem fair if we are to talk about de-escalation. I think de-escalation has always to be undertaken by the aggressor as opposed to the victim. And so I'll be thinking in this respect about Russia. And to me, it's actually hard to assess the true measure of belligerence in Russian population surveys to the extent that it matters. I mean, Russia is a personalistic dictatorship, so population doesn't necessarily make decisions. But as far as we can talk about popular or public opinion, most recent estimates suggest that about 20% are kind of hardcore supporters of the war, and then another 40% are kind of resigned conformists, ostensibly. So I guess that's maybe the good thing or the good news. Depends on what expectations you have coming in. But even those Russians who would like to see the war end actually embrace the perception that I described of Russia as the embattled fortress and the victim of international belligerence rather than perpetuator of aggression. So that's the real challenge, is how to, this is where the battle for hearts and minds would have to be fought. And in terms of how it can be fought, and I guess some forms of solidarities that cut across boundaries of national belonging is one answer. And it's a paradoxical that belligerent nationalists or liberal far right are much better capable of international solidarity sometimes. I mean, there's a lot of best practice sharing between the liberal far right. If you watch the Russian TV, it's a carbon copy of Fox News. And I think others are far behind on that in that respect. And I think professional solidarities are a very important resource, or other forms of solidarities, which are now, of course, almost impossible because of necessity to also express disapproval of what Russia is doing. So at an earlier stage, I spent quite a bit of energy trying to convince ASA to support, for example, the public opinion research centers and social studies centers and universities that were proclaimed foreign agents in Russia. And unfortunately, I didn't succeed, but this type of professional solidarity, I think, goes a long way, maybe before things get too far gone. And not to close on a depressing note, I'll just say as a segue to the comment about the mother nation and the daddy state, that one of the most interesting metaphors that came out of this war is one by Ukrainian writer Alona Stashkina, who wrote that your motherland is your child and not your mother. And I think this other form of nationalism that actually looks at the nation or the state as someone that adult citizens should tend and cultivate, and who sometimes misbehaves, is a hopeful metaphor for me.
Thanks, Olga. Sharon?
I really like that metaphor. I think I think that probably the first institutional source, I think, or at least I guess not source, but the potential solution is we have kind of spoken about the kind of social political economic marginalization experienced by a lot of working class people. That's kind of the context. I think to some extent, that I think there needs to be more redistributive politics that would help to kind of address some of the underlying issues there, right? And hopefully build up more, the kind of bottom-up civic life that's being declining. That's partly contribute to the kind of embrace of these more extreme form of nationalism. And the other thing I think Olga's mentioned is internationalism, certain kind of solidarity across borders, but also kind of highlighting common challenges, right? Such as climate change that I think would be important, and in terms of cultural resources, I think I do think that feminist revolution is still going on. That I think of advancing feminist critique of kind of masculine nationalism is something that that our society can build on, right? Can advance. And lastly, if social media to some extent has something to do with this extremization of nationalism, then certain kind of democratic regulation of social media may help. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Andreas?
I would like to, if I may, just very briefly come back to what I said about cultures of nationalism. And I made the argument that victimization nationalisms are more prone to become belligerent. Maybe that's actually not true upon further reflection. There's also the other version of nationalism that is quite belligerent, which is the victor's nationalism, which is the jingoist nationalism. So the kind of nationalism that motivates people to go to war, such as in faraway places, to get things right there, such as the Iraq War, 2003, or I'm thinking also about the Falkland War fought by the British in, when was that, 92, I think, which was also had these nationalist, victor nationalist, jingoist kind of underpinning. In any case, the question is the potential for de-escalation. We're asked to being optimistic. So let me give just three quick answers, which basically are related to the points that I made before about what's the causes or what are the institutional contexts and cultural contexts that produce the current resurgence of belligerent nationalism. So first, and in line with what Xiaohong said, constructing a world, a social world with chances for upward social mobility for more people, or at least stopping the trend of precarization and downward mobility. That's the first answer. It basically drains the pool of voters from which neo-nationalists draw their support. So I think that will be crucial, just to undermine the electoral appeal of neo-nationalists. And second, and that relates to the shift to a multipolar world. And sorry that I'm sounding like an IR, international relations kind of person here, but rather than a cultural sociologist, I think it would be crucial to recognize the legitimate security interests of rising powers, and that includes Russia and China. What that means in detail, I don't know, but I'm a big fan of actually giving security guarantees to both of these countries rather than threatening with total war. And of course, this needs to be balanced with the legitimate demands for self-determination of smaller states and minorities. I'm thinking of Ukrainians, I'm thinking of Taiwan, and so on and so on. So how to achieve that, a kind of a stable multipolar world where each of the great powers can settle in a relatively secure environment. How to do this? Is it even possible? I actually don't know. And then the third point is more a cultural point. I think an effective way to undermine belligerent nationalism would be to construct and develop a non-belligerent forms of nationalism. So liberals, in other words, rather than insisting on the legitimacy of a global order and things like that, they should embrace nationalist narratives and give them a different meaning, and point to the possibility of nationalism, of also like Immanuel Kant envisioned, I don't know how many 100 years ago, could also be the basis for a stable, non-war-prone international order. And that will be based on a simple recognition of the equality of the claims, and the basic kind of equality of in terms of legitimacy of political claims of all different countries around the world.
Well, wow. Thank you all very much. Such rich and thoughtful comments from all of you. Thank you, Olga Shevchenko, Xiaohong Xu, and Andreas Wiemer for your insightful comments. We definitely learned a lot. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. I will read them quickly. The first one is, how much does aggressive nationalism expressed externally depend on the availability of ethnic minorities internally who might be treated by authorities as a source of blame for the consequences of globalization? The Nazis used both internal and external, but Putin, as far as I can see, is focusing on the external. I'm not sure about China. Do the two always go together? Can one occur without the other? And we have a second question, perhaps while you're thinking about the first one. In Why War, Philip Smith argues that popular mobilization for war requires apocalyptic narratives about national threat trajectories rather than, for example, tragic narratives. Both may coexist, but apocalyptic narratives are needed for successful mobilization. So what does Smith's argument, does Smith's argument apply to contemporary cases? Any of the panelists would like to chime in?
I mean, if I may say something about the first one, if I understood correctly, the question is whether belligerent nationalism not only needs an enemy state against which it directs its foreign policy offensives, but also a domestic ethnic minority. So I would say that the two often go together, but you can also have cases of belligerent nationalism where the inner enemy is basically imagined and almost non-existent. So if you look at contemporary Poland, for example, well, I wouldn't call it the belligerent nationalism exactly, but certainly a very virulent nationalism. The other is, of course, the European Union and Russia. And on the far right of nationalist movement, you also have an imagined Jewish minority against which the nation also needs to defend itself. but that is not obviously not corresponding with any. I mean, the Jewish minority in Poland is basically, it's so small that it's largely an imagined minority. So I think belligerent nationalism needs, as it were, just the logic of opposition and the logic of belligerent opposition. They need enemies, both within and without, and the outside enemy often then is kind of the imagine, or the discourse about the outside enemy leads then to a fifth column discourse and rhetorics, and sometimes even the conjuring of the imagining of fifth columns out of nowhere.
Yeah, I want to echo this point. I think, it's not the belligerent nationalism doesn't have to be pointing their finger towards a specific ethnic minorities, right? They could be like the state could be oppressive towards ethnic minorities, as in the case of Uyghur population in China, right? But doesn't mean that they figure importantly in the nationalist discourse. But nevertheless, there will be this idea of internal sabotage, right, from this fifth column that undermine the national rejuvenation or return to its former glory.
Yeah, I would second that as well. I think so. The figure of foreign agent, I think, beautifully encapsulates how you can have both in one bag. Every Friday right now, the Russian one of Russian ministries publishes lists of foreign agents who are both internal, but they're enemies because they're channeling foreign influence. So you can actually have both wrapped in one conveniently. And I think the two nationalisms that I spoke for really can coincide. So now Russian ethnic minorities can be both subjects of oppression and discrimination, but at the same time, one form of that discrimination is they're disproportionately recruited to fight Russia's war with external enemies.
Yeah, and not sometimes not even ethnic minorities. It could be even LGBT communities, people like that, right, who would be considered sort of undermining the national integrity. I want to speak to Lynn Spielman's question. I think I'm not entirely sure that the apocalyptic discourse that I think there's if I'm correct that that there's this dimension that's about we have to do something here now, right? It could either be in ascending power like China would be, well, we time on our side, but we have to go quick. We cannot lose this window of opportunity. We have to act now. Yes, we had victimization in the past, but now we are on track to come back to our former glory. If we don't do anything now, we will lose this opportunity, right? So that national mobilization is premised on this idea that this is the moment that we need to seize, and it could be the other way, right? It could be for, let's say, a declining power. Although still, I'm not saying that in reality whether China is ascending power or U.S. is declining power, but let's say the perception, right? Then the U.S. would be you could have people that make America great again. It's about well, yes, we're declining, but we have to seize this opportunity, because if we lose this opportunity, right, then we're doomed. So we have to fight back. I think that there has to be some kind of discourse about these impending moment of turning the tide in either way to its own favor. That's very critical for mobilization.
I would say, if I may add, in the Russian case, I do think it tracks in terms of the existence of apocalyptic narratives. Again, these are not narratives. Well, there were some almost like urban myths about illicit activities by Ukrainian nationalists who are bringing in, poisoned pigeons and biomedical laboratories to poison Russians. So there was a bit of that, but most apocalyptic discourses are about the decline of the West under the combined effects of lack of Russian energy and the LGBT revolution. So, it's impossible to turn on TV right now, any channel, and not hear about how West is teetering on the brink of collapse. So it's actually not Russia's apocalypse, but the Western one that fuels this.
Fortunately, we have run out of time, and I would like to thank you again for the wonderful contributions. We have learned a lot today. So thank you, Olga Shevchenko, Xiaohong Xu, and Andreas Wimmer. Thank you very much for your insightful comments.